60%. That is the share of every barrel of crude oil that flows into an American refinery and comes out as gasoline, jet fuel, diesel, and heating oil that started its life not in Texas, not in the Gulf of Mexico, not in Alaska, but in Canada. 60% of American crude oil imports. The lifeblood of the American economy. The fuel that moves the trucks, fills the tanks, powers the planes, heats the homes. 60% of it crosses the northern border before it ever touches an American refinery. And here is the part that should stop you. The refineries those barrels flow into were not designed to accept just any crude oil in the world. They were engineered specifically, expensively, and irreversibly to process Canadian heavy crude. The infrastructure is locked in, the investment is sunk, the chemistry is fixed. You cannot turn a Midwest refinery that has been processing Alberta bitumen for 30 years into a facility that can run Saudi light sweet crude in an afternoon. Or a year, or a decade. Not without an investment that would cost billions of dollars and take the better part of a decade to execute. So when Donald Trump looked at the Canada-United States relationship and decided that tariffs were the lever, when he imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum and a 10% tariff on Canadian energy, and then stood in front of cameras and told Americans he was going to make their gas cheaper, he was doing something that had a very specific consequence in very specific places. He was taxing the only crude oil his own refineries were built to run on. This is the story of that decision. It is a story about engineering locked in decades ago, about a refining system that cannot pivot, about a trade war aimed directly at its own supply chain, and about what happens when the most powerful man in the world tries to punish a neighbor he has become structurally dependent on. I am Richard Stone. This is Stone Analysis. No filler, no spin, just the strategic read told straight. Here is what the conventional conversation sounds like. Trump imposed tariffs on Canada. Canada complained. There was some diplomatic tension. Mark Carney made some strong statements. And the assumption underneath most of the coverage is that this is a manageable friction between two countries that trade a lot and will eventually work something out because they always do. That assumption is wrong. Not because the relationship is broken, but because it misses what is actually happening underneath the trade rhetoric, in the basements of refineries in Ohio and Michigan and Illinois and Minnesota and Pennsylvania and Oklahoma. The conventional story treats this as a trade dispute about tariffs and numbers on a spreadsheet. The real story is about a physical system, a continental infrastructure of pipelines and refineries and processing units that was designed as one integrated machine with a border running through the middle of it. And when you impose a tariff on one end of that machine, you do not renegotiate a supply chain. You tax a fact of engineering. Today, I want to walk you through 4 things that mainstream coverage has not connected. First, why American Midwest refineries cannot switch crude suppliers the way a buyer switches vendors at a hardware store, and what that means for every American who buys gas. Second, what Trump's tariffs actually did inside those refineries, in dollar terms, in margin terms, in the terms that show up at the pump. Third, why the Iran conflict and the Hormuz situation have made Canada's position in that equation stronger, not weaker, in the last 90 days. And fourth, 3 scenarios for where this goes, each with a probability, so you can think about what to watch for. By the end of this, the gas price you paid last week is going to look like a different kind of story than the one you were told. To understand why American refineries cannot simply switch away from Canadian crude, you have to understand what crude oil actually is, because most coverage treats it as one undifferentiated commodity. A barrel of oil is a barrel of oil. That framing is completely wrong. Crude oil varies enormously in 2 critical dimensions. The first is density, measured on something called the API gravity scale. Light crude has a high API gravity number. It flows easily, it is cheap to process, and it naturally yields more of the premium products refiners love: gasoline, jet fuel, and diesel. Heavy crude has a low API gravity number. It is thick and dense. It requires far more processing. But when you invest in the equipment to handle it, it can be dramatically cheaper to buy because fewer refiners in the world can run it. The second dimension is sulfur content. Sweet crude has almost no sulfur and is easy to refine. Sour crude has significant sulfur and requires additional processing units called hydrotreaters and sulfur recovery units to turn it into a usable product. Canada's oil sands crude, the heavy bitumen that flows out of Alberta, is the most extreme version of heavy and sour that exists at industrial scale anywhere on Earth. Its API gravity sits in the range of 8 to 12 degrees. By comparison, the light sweet crude from Saudi Arabia that the benchmark price is often quoted against sits around 34 degrees. Western Canadian Select, the benchmark blend that moves down from Alberta, is one of the heaviest, most sulfur-dense crude oils traded globally. You cannot put that crude oil into a refinery that was not built for it. It would not even flow through the pipes properly at ambient temperature. It has to be diluted with lighter hydrocarbons called diluent, typically natural gas condensate, before it can be pumped at all. And then when it arrives at a refinery, it requires a specific set of processing units. Cokers, which break the heavy residual material into lighter fractions by heating it to extreme temperatures. Hydrocrackers, which add hydrogen under pressure to further upgrade the molecules. Complex sulfur removal systems. These are not universal. They are purpose-built investments that a refinery makes once, at a cost of hundreds of millions to billions of dollars, and that then define what kind of crude that refinery can profitably run for the next 30 to 50 years. Beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s and 90s and 2000s, American refiners, especially in the Midwest, made exactly that investment. They looked at Alberta. They saw essentially unlimited supplies of cheap, heavy crude that nobody else in the world had the processing infrastructure to run. They built the cokers and the hydrocrackers and the complex treating units. They connected themselves to the pipeline system that was being built out across Canada, and they locked themselves in, deliberately, because the economics were compelling. They could buy cheap Canadian crude that their competitors could not process, run it through their expensive complex units, and sell refined products at the same market price as everyone else. The spread between cheap feedstock and market price products was their profit. By the time Donald Trump took office, that investment was 3 or 4 decades old and deeply embedded. The United States Energy Information Administration, the EIA, which tracks these things in more granular detail than almost any other government data source in the world, reported that Canadian crude accounted for roughly 60% of all United States crude oil imports. And the concentration was highest exactly in the Midwest, the refining region that processes Canadian crude most heavily. In the states of Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the broader Midwest Petroleum Administration for Defense District, Canadian crude was not a significant input. It was the dominant input. In some individual refineries, the number was not 60%, it was 90%. These refineries did not gradually accumulate this dependence the way a bad habit forms. They made deliberate capital decisions over decades to configure themselves specifically for Canadian heavy crude because it was the most profitable feedstock available to them. The infrastructure reflects those decisions. The coking units, the hydrocrackers, the diluent handling systems, the pipeline connections running north to south, all of it was built for one specific kind of oil from one specific place. And here is the critical point for everything that comes later. You cannot undo that configuration quickly. A refinery that has been running on Canadian heavy crude for 30 years cannot pivot to running on Permian Basin light sweet crude in any time frame that matters for a trade war. The economics are wrong. The chemistry is wrong. Light sweet crude going through a coker is not just suboptimal, it is wasteful. You are running an expensive piece of complex equipment on a feedstock that does not need that level of processing. You would produce too much coke and not enough of the higher value products. A refinery optimized for heavy crude, running light crude, is like a diesel engine trying to run on gasoline. It works in a rough sense, but it destroys the economic case for the entire facility. So the refiners built for Canadian crude. The infrastructure exists as it does. And then in 2025, the tariff came. Let me give you the arithmetic, because this is where the abstract becomes money. Trump's tariff on Canadian energy was 10%. Not 25% like steel and aluminum, but 10%, which sounds modest until you apply it to the actual volume. In a typical year, the United States imports somewhere in the range of 4 million barrels of Canadian crude oil per day. 4 million barrels per day. And the price of Western Canadian Select at the time the tariffs hit was somewhere in the range of $50 to $60 per barrel after the discount it trades at relative to the benchmark. 10% of $55 is $5.50 per barrel. 4 million barrels per day at $5.50 per barrel is $22 million per day in additional cost landing directly on the refiners who had no option but to keep buying that crude. $22 million per day is approximately $8 billion per year as a transfer from American refinery margins to the tariff account. And that money does not disappear. It either comes out of refinery profit margins, which is possible for some period, or it goes into the price of the refined products coming out of the refinery, which means gasoline and diesel and jet fuel and heating oil. And in the environment of mid-2026, with Brent crude already trading above $100 per barrel because of the Hormuz situation, with American refineries already squeezed by the run-up in crude costs from the Iran conflict, the room to absorb $8 billion per year in additional tariff cost without passing it to the consumer was essentially zero. The refineries that were built to run Canadian crude were running it. They could not stop running it. And they were paying an American government tariff every single day on the crude oil that was the only feedstock their facilities could profitably process. The tariff was not hitting a foreign country. It was hitting an American industry's cost structure, and the cost was flowing directly to the pump. The gas price increase that millions of American drivers noticed between early 2025 and mid-2026 has multiple contributors. The Iran conflict and the crude oil price spike it caused is a major one. The structural tightness of global refining capacity is another. But sitting underneath both of those larger forces is the quiet arithmetic of a 10% tariff applied 4 million times every day to the one crude oil American Midwest refineries were built to run. You cannot tariff your way to cheaper gas when the tariff is on the crude oil your refinery cannot replace. Here is where the strategic picture gets genuinely interesting and where the conventional narrative loses the thread entirely. When Trump imposed tariffs on Canada, the assumption in Washington, stated plainly by the administration's trade advisors, was that Canada would feel the pressure most acutely, that Canadian producers and exporters would have no alternative to the American market and would capitulate on whatever terms Washington wanted in order to keep access. That assumption was based on a version of Canadian energy dependence that was accurate in 2010 and has been progressively less accurate every year since. The key development is Trans Mountain. The Trans Mountain expansion project, which began carrying oil in commercial quantities in mid-2024, created the first significant Pacific Coast pipeline outlet for Alberta crude. Before Trans Mountain was expanded, Alberta's oil had essentially one place to go: south. The existing pipeline network ran almost exclusively toward American markets. Alberta producers had no realistic alternative to selling to American refineries. When American refiners knew that, they extracted a discount. Western Canadian Select traded at a very large discount to the American West Texas Intermediate benchmark precisely because Canadian sellers had nowhere else to go. The American buyers knew it. They priced that captivity into every barrel. Trans Mountain changed the math. Not immediately, not dramatically overnight, but structurally. Alberta crude can now reach tankers at the Westridge Marine Terminal in Burnaby, British Columbia. And from there, it can go to South Korea, Japan, India, and most importantly, China. Chinese refineries have their own coking capacity. They can run heavy crude. And China's demand for crude oil at competitive prices is not a small footnote. China is the second largest oil consumer on Earth. By early 2026, Trans Mountain was moving somewhere in the range of 600,000 barrels per day and building toward its design capacity of 890,000 barrels per day. Not enough to replace American market access for Canadian crude in its entirety, but enough to create an alternative price point, enough to establish that Western Canadian Select does not have to take whatever discount American refiners choose to offer. And here's the specific mechanism that matters for the Trump tariff situation. When the United States imposed a 10% tariff on Canadian energy, the economics of sending barrels to Asia via Trans Mountain versus sending them south into the American market became, in certain conditions, competitive or even favorable. The tariff that Washington designed to pressure Canada was simultaneously improving the relative economics of Canada selling its oil somewhere else. Mark Carney's government was explicit about this, not in inflammatory language, but in the careful language of a central banker who understands leverage. The framing from Ottawa has been consistent. Canadian energy is a Canadian strategic resource. Canada is diversifying its markets. Canada is not dependent on a single buyer. These are not threats. They are statements of commercial fact backed by a piece of infrastructure that was built over years and is now operational. From a Midwest refiner's perspective, The worst version of this scenario is not a dramatic cutoff. It is a gradual tightening of supply availability combined with upward price pressure as Canadian producers exercise more option value from alternative markets. The structural captivity that let American refiners extract a discount on Canadian crude for decades is unwinding. And it is unwinding fastest exactly when the tariff environment makes the alternative most attractive. Washington designed a tariff to pressure Canada. Canada's infrastructure investment, made years before the trade war, has turned that pressure into a leverage dynamic that runs in the opposite direction from the one the administration intended. Now layer on top of everything I just described what has happened to global crude oil markets in the context of the United States-Iran conflict. When the Strait of Hormuz became a contested waterway in the military operations of 2025 and 2026, when tanker insurance rates spiked and shipping schedules became uncertain, and Brent crude moved above $100 a barrel for the first time in years, the pressure on American refinery margins compounded. American refineries were already paying more for Canadian crude because of the tariff. They were already facing a narrowing discount from Canadian suppliers because of Trans Mountain. And now, the global crude oil benchmark was elevated because of a conflict 8,000 miles away that was disrupting the waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil normally moves. These are not three separate problems. They interact. Higher Brent prices mean higher reference prices for all crude. Higher reference prices mean the tariff cost, which is 10% of the purchase price, is 10% of a bigger number. Narrowing Canadian discounts mean less cushion for Midwest refiners who had historically benefited from cheap feedstock. And Hormuz uncertainty makes the alternative of importing light sweet crude from the Middle East more expensive and less reliable at exactly the moment when some refiners might have otherwise considered it. The Iran conflict, which the administration presented as a demonstration of American strength, created a crude oil market condition that made the tariff on Canadian energy more costly for American refiners and consumers, not less. The geopolitical decision and the trade policy decision compounded against the economic interest of the American drivers who are paying the result at the pump. There is also a subtler strategic dimension here that deserves attention. When Hormuz becomes uncertain, the security premium on oil supply routes that do not pass through the Persian Gulf increases. Pipelines from Canada to the American Midwest do not pass through the Strait of Hormuz. They do not pass through any choke point controlled by a hostile state. They move oil from Alberta to Illinois over land, under American and Canadian territory, through infrastructure whose security is essentially guaranteed by the political stability of two of the most institutionally stable democracies in the world. In an environment of genuine concern about Hormuz reliability, Canadian crude is not just the crude that American refineries were built to run. It is also the crude whose supply security is highest among all the alternatives. Strategically, as the Hormuz risk premium rises, the case for Canadian supply strengthens. The case for maintaining and expanding the North American Energy Partnership strengthens. The case for removing the tariff that is making that partnership more expensive strengthens. The administration has been making the argument that American energy security requires domestic production. That argument has genuine merit in some contexts. But for the specific refineries that were built for Canadian heavy crude, in the specific moment when global crude markets are elevated and Hormuz is uncertain, the most secure energy supply is not hypothetical future domestic production. It is the pipeline running from Alberta to the Midwest that has been operating reliably for decades. Canada is holding, in this particular moment, something that looks a lot like the most secure, most infrastructure integrated, most supply chain certain crude oil in the American import market. And Ottawa knows it. Kevin Byrne is the Vice President and Chief Analyst for North American crude oil markets at S&P Global Commodity Insights. He is one of the most cited analysts on the Canadian crude market in the world. When asked about the impact of tariffs on Canadian crude flows, his assessment has been consistent. The pipelines go where the pipelines go. You cannot reroute decades of infrastructure with a tariff announcement. The refiners that were built for Canadian crude will continue to run Canadian crude. The question is, who bears the cost? The American Petroleum Institute, the main industry lobbying group for American oil and gas, which is not exactly a pro-Canada advocacy organization, raised specific concerns with the administration's tariff framework as it applies to energy. The API's explicit argument was that tariffs on Canadian crude oil increase costs for American refiners and ultimately for American consumers, without producing a corresponding increase in American oil production that could substitute for the Canadian supply. The logic was not about Canada's interests, it was about American refinery economics. Even the domestic oil industry's most powerful advocate told the administration that tariffing Canadian crude was self-inflicted. The EIA data, which is the most authoritative source available, shows Canadian crude consistently at 60% or more of total United States crude oil imports over the years leading up to 2025. This is not a marginal relationship, it is a structural one, and the EIA has no political motive to overstate it. The Canadian Energy Regulator, the federal agency in Ottawa that oversees Canadian energy infrastructure, published capacity data showing Trans Mountain's throughput growth through early 2026. That data makes visible the alternative market access that Alberta crude now has, and that gives Ottawa a lever it did not have 5 years ago. Let me give you 3 scenarios for where this goes, each with a probability, and I want to be transparent about the assumptions underlying each one. Scenario 1. The tariff gets resolved through negotiation, with energy carved out of the broader Canada-United States trade framework. Probability? 25%. In this scenario, the economic pressure from refinery margins and gas prices creates enough domestic political pain for the administration that it accepts a face-saving structure that exempts energy from the tariff regime or significantly reduces it. This would require Trump to acknowledge that the tariff on Canadian energy was hurting American consumers, which runs against the core logic of how the administration communicates its trade policy. It would also require Carney to offer something on another dimension of the relationship that allows Trump to present the energy concession as a victory on a different front. This path exists. It has been the resolution of previous Canada-United States trade tensions, but it requires political conditions that do not currently appear to be in place. Scenario 2. The tariff remains, Canadian crude exports continue to flow, costs remain elevated, and Trans Mountain gradually changes the long-run price dynamic. Probability, 55%. This is the most likely outcome because it requires the least active decision from either side. The refineries keep running. They keep buying Canadian crude because they have no alternative. The tariff cost flows through into product prices. The 10 to 15 cent per gallon contribution of tariff-elevated crude costs to American gas prices becomes a structural feature of the market. Meanwhile, Trans Mountain throughput grows, Asian buyers take a larger share of Alberta's production, the discount that Canadian crude trades at relative to benchmark narrows gradually, and over the medium term, American Midwest refiners find their feedstock cost advantage from Canadian crude shrinking. They do not dramatically change their operations, but the profitability of having invested in Canadian heavy crude processing capacity 10 or 20 years ago gradually diminishes. This scenario does not resolve. It just grinds. Scenario 3. A significant deterioration in Hormuz or a broader Middle East escalation forces a strategic reassessment of North American energy integration. Probability, 20%. In this scenario, a genuine supply disruption from the Persian Gulf region, not just elevated prices but actual physical disruption to oil flows, forces a rapid reassessment of every dimension of American energy security. In that environment, the argument that Canada is a threatening trade partner whose energy should be taxed becomes untenable against the backdrop of tankers unable to move through Hormuz. The administration pivots to an emergency framework that removes energy trade barriers between Canada and the United States and explicitly designates Canada as a partner in a North American energy security architecture. This is the path that multiple analysts in Washington and Ottawa consider the most strategically logical given the underlying realities. But strategic logic and political logic do not always align quickly enough to prevent significant damage in the interim. The most important thing to watch is not the headline tariff rate. Watch the spread between Western Canadian Select and the West Texas Intermediate benchmark. That spread, which you can track publicly through the EIA or the Canadian Energy Regulator, is the most honest, real-time indicator of how the market is pricing Canadian crude relative to alternatives. A widening spread means Canadian sellers are accepting more discount, which means Trans Mountain is not yet providing enough pull from Asian markets to change the price dynamic. A narrowing spread means the opposite. It means Canadian producers are getting more than they used to from the combination of Asian market access and elevated global prices, and American refiners are feeling that in their margins. That number tells you more about where this relationship is going than any press conference or trade negotiation announcement. Step back from all of this and look at the shape of the story. For 30 to 40 years, American Midwest refiners made a deliberate infrastructure investment. They built the cokers and the hydrocrackers and the diluent systems. They connected themselves to the Canadian pipeline network. They engineered themselves specifically and irreversibly to run on Alberta heavy crude. They did it because it was the most profitable feedstock available to them, and the economics were compelling as long as Canadian producers had no alternative market and had to sell at a deep discount. That system worked quietly and profitably for decades. Nobody ran stories about it. Nobody made speeches about it. It was the invisible plumbing of American gasoline, humming along under the surface of a relationship that both countries were too comfortable to examine closely. And then a trade war started, and the tariff landed on Canadian energy. And the president told Americans he was going to make their gas cheaper. And the refineries that were built for Canadian crude kept buying Canadian crude because there was nothing else they could run, and paying the tariff and passing the cost through, and the gas price kept rising, and nobody explained why. Trans Mountain keeps loading tankers. Asian buyers keep booking cargoes. The discount on Western Canadian Select keeps narrowing, 1/4 point at a time. And every barrel that finds a home in South Korea or Japan, instead of an Ohio refinery, is a quiet message from Canadian infrastructure to American trade policy. Mark Carney has not threatened to cut off American refineries. He has not needed to. The investment made years ago to build Trans Mountain, the investment made in Canadian refining capacity, the investment in Asian energy relationships, those are the message. They say, as calmly and as precisely as a central banker can say anything, that Canada has options. The refineries America built in the Midwest were designed to run on Canadian oil. The man responsible for that oil sits in Ottawa. And the trade war aimed at Canada is raising the price of the very crude those refineries cannot replace. The gas price is not just a consequence of the Iran conflict or global crude markets or domestic supply constraints. It is, in part, the arithmetic of a tariff applied 4 million times every day to the one crude oil the American Midwest was built to run on. The next time someone fills their tank and winces at the number, they are, in part, paying for a trade decision that taxed the supply chain America itself created. I am Richard Stone. This is Stone Analysis. The decisions are being made. I will see you when the next one matters.